Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, still making Halloween cards. This one was a combination of things. I wanted to make more cards doing the background technique I had shown a couple videos ago, which I will link to, that was inspired by Stacy Hutchison. And I will link to her original blog post in my blog post, because she has like a picture tutorial. So I did that other video making those spooky backgrounds. And then I kept thinking about this background stamp from Simon Says Stamp. So this is the spooky silhouette background. I've already done a video using this, but I wanted to combine this with that technique. And to get it the way I wanted it, I took a few steps to make this work, because my concern was lining up the moon portion with the opening on this stamp. So what I figured out was the easiest way to do this was I basically kind of made myself a template. So I'm just stamping this background onto a 6x6 piece of vellum. And what I should have done right here was I should have heat embossed this. I should have just poured clear embossing powder over it and heat embossed it, because I stamped this onto vellum with the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And because it's vellum, this ink just sits there and I got it everywhere. I was smearing it all over the place. So I should have, thought I had, because even heat setting it would have taken a while, because, this is so much ink sitting on this vellum. So, in hindsight, if you were to do something like this, pour clear embossing powder over it, and then it's good to go. Because, literally, I'm not even kidding, this piece of vellum sat on my desk for about 2 or 3 days, and it was still wet, because it's just the nature of vellum. Anyway, I have my template, because I want to line up my A2 cardstock. You could technically do just stamp everything and do everything in 6x6 and then cut it down for, an A2 card. But even then, you still need to be able to line up that moon area. So I did some fiddling. I'm going to leave the stamp in my MISTI here, and then I've got a piece of A2 sized cardstock, and I'm kind of just figuring out where I'm going to need to put that so that when I stamp the image, it's going to stamp in the same place, etc. So I've kind of figured out my layout, where I'm going to place my cardstock. I've die cut a piece of YUPO paper. Again, you could use a clear transparency, anything like that, but YUPO paper isn't just nice because you can reuse it over and over again as well. It die cuts easily, whereas sometimes trying to die cut transparencies or acetate, etc. can get a little tricky. But I have my A2 cardstock, I have my circle of YUPO paper, and now I have some distress watercolor paper in the A2 size. So what I figured out what was working best is I flip over my little template onto my grid paper here, because again, that ink is wet. And then I'm just placing my circle of YUPO paper where the moon portion is. And then just kind of lining up my distressed watercolor paper with that. And I'd put a little piece of washi tape on the back of that YUPO circle. And then it's just kind of being temporarily held into place. So once that's there, this technique is the same as my other video. So I'm using Distress Spray Stains, which are clear and very vibrant and bright. And then I'm only using one Distress Oxide spray, because I had comments about that. People are like, oh, my spray, mine don't look the same. There's a big difference in the looks between spray stains and oxide sprays. Look up Tim Holtz YouTube channel, because there's tons, so many videos with so much information, all of it. But either one's gonna work. I've also had people tagging me in videos and stuff, or in pictures. They've been making it work using jelly plates and distress inks and distress oxide inks and whatnot. There's ways to do this sort of a background. And like I said, I will link to Stacy's blog post in my blog post again, just to check it out, because she came up with just the neatest way to make this spooky moon. So that's what I'm kind of doing here. You just kind of play with it. So I'd use that YUPO circle to mask off the first sprays, and then I'd remove the circle, smushed it into the spray ink and whatnot, dried, and I kept drying it in between with my heat tool so that it doesn't become a complete muddy mess. And then I finally sprayed, I'd removed that YUPO circle and I sprayed the center with water, and that's what's causing everything to run, because spray stains, oxide sprays, all that is very water reactive, and that's how you get this crazy spooky sort of a look. So I sprayed this. I'm working on just my Tonic craft mat for this, and I'm also using that big white cloth I kind of keep pulling out and dabbing at. It's just my flower sack cloth, and I'll have links to everything I used in the description box below, as well as on my blog. And like I'd mentioned about this die cut YUPO circle, the nice thing about YUPO is it's not actually paper. It's like a form of plastic. So I can just wipe it off. Like, it will stain. Like, it's got stains from the inks and all that, but I can wipe it off and keep reusing it over and over again. And I keep these with my circle wafer dies, so that if I ever need another mask, etc., I can just grab this. So after doing this once, I'm just repeating the process. I've lined up that circle on the back of that vellum like template, and then pressed my distress watercolor paper onto it. So now the circle is masked off, and then I'm spraying it again with distress spray stains. So the first one I'd done, I used picked raspberry, carved pumpkin, black soot. This one I'm using milled lavender, seedless preserves, and black soot. And it's a messy technique, especially when I do it. I had ink all over me, have it all over my hands. If that kind of thing sort of bothers you, like, you could wear some, like, you know, vinyl gloves or nightshell gloves or whatever. I don't mind the ink because it comes off, you know, within a day or so between just regular hand washing and whatnot. But yeah, it gets messy, but it's so fun. So same thing. I sprayed with that circle, masking everything, removed the circle, dried it with my heat tool, pressed it into the residual like spray on my mat, dried it again with my heat tool, and then finally sprayed with just water in the center of that moon area, so it starts pulling all that ink towards the center, which is what creates that spooky look. So you could add more splatter. I did in the previous video. With these, I just left them as is. So now they're completely dry. I have my MISTI again with the stamp that I haven't moved, and my kind of, you know, my positioning template of that aqua colored A2 piece of cardstock. And I just lined up my background now in that exact same spot. It doesn't need to be 100% perfect, but I've just kind of lined it up. I heavily used anti-static powder on this. And then I inked up the stamp again with that VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And I'm going to stamp this on my background. Now, in the video, it looks like it's stamped very solid. In real life, it didn't, but I'm not worried about that. But there's like a bunch of like missing spots, because even though this is the smooth-sided distress watercolor cardstock, there's still a bit of texture to it. So it didn't stamp as solid as I would like. However, I was going to use the embossing powder anyway, so I was fine with that. So I'm using the Tonic Glitter Noir embossing powder again, because it's gorgeous. It's so perfect for Halloween cards. I love it because it's black and sparkly. So I poured that over this stamp background, and basically it covers up almost all of that, the background I created, leaving just the moon area, which was what I was going for. This is what was kind of building my head, because I was like, this would look so cool framed by that stamp with the, you know, big haunted house and the glitter, everything. So after I stamped it, I melted everything with my heat tool. So now I've got this great big huge spooky sort of moon framed by this spooky silhouette background stamp. So after I did the first one and it worked this whole time, like I was filming this, but this whole time this was just a big experiment. I wasn't even sure if this was going to work. So then I did the exact same process with the first background I had made. So, and again, you could do this like multiple times. I only did 2, but I could have done 10, but time always runs away with me. So same thing, lined up the background on top of that aqua cardstock, heavily used the anti-static powder tool, and then inked up the stamp with the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, stamp that onto my background, and then I'm going to coat it again with that Glitter Noir embossing powder, and then melt that with my heat tool. You could technically stamp this in like clear. I prefer using, with something like this and this specific background, etc., everything, I prefer stamping in black, because it just also helps kind of fill in any little gaps that might be missed with the embossing powder, etc. So to each their own. Like, again, this gets to be a messy technique. You're using, you know, messy dark inks and the vellum and all that stuff, but it's worth it. It's fun. I had so much fun making these. So again, coated everything with that embossed powder, melted it all with my heat tool. You lose some of the definition, like this background has like those bats in silhouette too, especially along the top. And you kind of lose that along the top because I'd stamped everything or sprayed like the black soot, distress stain and oxide spray and whatnot. But again, it's more, I wanted the focus obviously to be more on the actual like haunted house, the big moon, etc. So I've got my backgrounds. And then for my sentiment, I'm using the CZ Design Trick or Treat wafer die. And the actual trick or treat word or words I wanted in that same black glitter. So the easiest way to do this was I just took a piece of black cardstock, pressed it really, really well into my clear embossing pad. So the whole piece of cardstock is coated in the clear embossing ink. And then I'm going to coat it with that glitter noir embossing powder and melt that with my heat tool. I have glitter paper, tons of colors of glitter papers, but the black ones I have just weren't doing it for me. Not for this card. They were just different. One was more like solid black, and then the other one compared to these backgrounds looked almost purple. So make my own. It works just fine. So melted this with my heat tool. So now I've got this piece of black cardstock completely coated with that glitter noir embossing powder. So it's all sparkly, it's melted, it's good to go. So then I just need to run this through my die cutting machine with that Trick or Treat wafer die. So I ran that through, and because it is heat embossed like this, it's different. If you've ever die cut glitter cardstock, usually you don't have a problem. Like, it comes out almost fine. But like detailed die cuts can be a little more tricky, and especially with embossing powder, because it's been embossed, it almost wants to, it really like holds into the wafer die. So all I did was just took my die pick and just very light, like I pressed through the holes, and then I just very lightly like kind of nudged it out of the wafer die, and it's good to go. Like, I didn't lose any, the glitter didn't crack, like the embossing powder didn't crack or flake off or anything. You just got to be a little more aware when you are removing it from the wafer die. And that's all I had to do. So I just went like bit by bit, took it out, put the adhesive on the back of it, and then I had die cut the outline that comes with this wafer die. I had die cut that from the VELLUM. So I'm just adhering the little, the actual words to this VELLUM outline. So I just started kind of from the top and worked my way down. So the little 2 letters for the word or just popped out quite easily. It was the big, like the trick word and the treat word that I just had to use my craft pick to just kind of run it along and, you know, nudge this out without ripping it. It wasn't difficult. So same thing, applied the adhesive very lightly to the back because I don't want the adhesive like oozing all out over the VELLUM. And then using my little reverse tweezers here really helps to kind of line things up. So I'm, again, not getting adhesive everywhere, because I do that too. I get ink all over me, I'll get glue all over me. The ink doesn't bother me. I've said this in other videos, I don't like getting glue on my hands. It really bugs me. So I either have to like wipe it off immediately, or I'll, you know, use my reverse tweezers, etc. So I have my sentiments. They're die cut, they're adhered to the VELLUM background, and then I also pulled out the Halloween printables from Simon that I'd used in the other video as well. So I just use my Fiskars trimmer for this, because I like, with my Fiskars trimmer, it has the little wire down the middle, so I can see exactly where I'm cutting. So it just makes it easier to cut apart these sentiments. So cut the sentiments that I wanted. So I've got a couple sentiments here. And in the previous video, I just cut the sentiments and then adhered them like as is. Didn't, you know, do anything to them. Now, these are printed on heavyweight white cardstock with toner ink. So you can foil these. I haven't tried it yet. I know other people have with great success. Me and foiling things like this just have a very love-hate relationship. I struggle. I love foil. Some days I'm willing to try and play with it, and other days, like, yeah, today was not the day for that. So rather than do that, I was like, I don't want to leave them white. What can I was like, I could sponge ink, I could do this. And then I was like, hey, why not just like kind of mess them up a bit? So I took those same spray stains, and I'm not spraying them. I'm just tapping the nozzle kind of like on my craft mat here, just to get the teeniest little drops, because I don't need very much, because these are small. So barely any. And this was enough to do like 10 in the end. So I used the picked raspberry, carved pumpkin, and the black soot again. I sprayed it with water, and then I just pressed the cut sentiment like right into that. So it's just going to pick up all that ink. And then I'm also just kind of running the edges along some of the black drops of the black soot distress spray stain. And then off camera there, I'm just kind of dabbing it onto my flour sack cloth, just so it's not completely like dripping with color, because one, it's going to completely wreck that piece of paper, and two, I don't need that much on it. So worked with the first one. So the second one, I did the exact same thing. So I've got the milled lavender, like little bits of the spray stain on there, a little bit of the seedless preserves, and then a tiny little bit of the black soot. Spray it with just a little bit of water, and then press that sentiment right into that to give it that mottled, kind of more dirty sort of look that I want to go with these backgrounds. And same thing, just kind of tap or like dab off any of the excess ink, and then I'm just going to let these sit and completely dry. So set those aside, let those dry. While those are drying, since I decided not to go with any stark white, I like the white. I sometimes think it frames everything nicely, like my card base, etc. But this time decided to try something different. So I masked off my card base here. I have as just an A2 top folding card base. So I masked off the top portion because that's going to the area past the masking tape there is going to be technically the back of the card. So I masked that off with some memo tape, and then I'm just lightly sponging on some picked raspberry Distress Oxide ink. I'm not doing a perfect blend. It doesn't need to be smooth. I just wanted a bit of color because the backgrounds, both backgrounds, I'd cut down slightly smaller than A2 to kind of frame them up a bit better. And I just want that little bit of color kind of peeking out around the edge instead of the stark white card base. So I did that with both card bases. The first one I did the picked raspberry, and then this second one I'm going to do the seedless preserves. I'm not going to worry about, like I said, the smooth, perfect blend. I just want the color on there. It's such a narrow area that it doesn't need to be perfect. Plus, with this whole, spooky background, etc., I would rather it not be perfect. So I just blended that on with my mini ink blending tool, and then removed the mask. I saved that little memo tape mask, and I'm going to use that on the inside of the cards because, of course, I have to finish the insides as well. So for the insides of the cards, I'm going to mask what will be the upper portion of the inside. So I just apply the mask like so. And then I have my spooky silhouette background. I just took it out of my MISTI, and I am inking this up with the milled lavender Distress Oxide ink. And then I'm also going to use some seedless preserves. So I started with just the ink pad, pressing it onto the stamp. And then I'm just using the mini ink blending tool and pressing the ink more onto the stamp. I've shown this also in more recent videos. I'm really liking how there's just something about these ink pads, this ink, and it works quite well for stamping, but I find it works even better if you use the mini ink blending tool. The sponge seems to just really even out the ink on the stamp. I've been really impressed with this. So I started with the milled lavender, and then I picked up the seedless preserves also on its own mini ink blending tool, and I just kind of lightly dab that around the image so that I'll get the two colors kind of mixing in together. I didn't add any black because I didn't want to add a whole lot, because this is a big background stamp. It's taking up the entire inside of the card. So I didn't want to add any black because I didn't want to just really cover up almost all the inside of the card. So I brought my card base, the inside of the card, to this background. I wasn't paying enough attention and didn't really press down properly on the top. So I very carefully kind of relined it up again. I could see where I, got the impression the first time. So I lined it up really well and just pressed right along the spine of the card. And then I can remove my memo tape, clean off my stamp, and then repeat the process with the other card base, which I'm using the Carved Pumpkin Distress Oxide ink and the Picked Raspberry Distress Oxide ink. So I started with the Carved Pumpkin, applied the ink directly with the ink pad, smoothed it out with the mini ink blending tool, and then I picked up ink on the Picked Raspberry blending tool and dabbed that onto the background as well. And if my Picked Raspberry blending tool especially really picked up a lot of that Carved Pumpkin ink, the orange ink onto the pink. So I just cleaned off my mini ink blending tool. I just rubbed it on paper, on the same grid paper in the end. That removed the excess ink, and it's good to go. So I never wash my blending tools, by the way. Some people have asked me that in the past. Do I wash the sponges? Never. I keep them for each color, and that's all there is to it. I don't ever wash it. They work better. The more ink they have in them, they work better, in my opinion. So back to the cards. I lined them up in my MISTI, and then I'm using sentiments from the Handlettered Halloween stamp set. So inked up the big Happy Halloween sentiment with that VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And since I had it lined up in my MISTI, I can just line up the second card base, stamp the sentiment again after inking it up, and then both insides of both cards are done. So then all I have to do now is start adhering everything. So like I'd mentioned, I'd cut down both of these backgrounds that I had created. So they're slightly smaller than the card base. And then I'm just adhering them to each card base with Simon's Craft Tacky glue. So the card base that I had inked up with the picked raspberry ink is the one that I'm going to add the background I created with the picked raspberry and carved pumpkins, so that, you know, everything coordinates. And then the big trick or treat sentiment, I'm applying the Craft Tacky glue to the back of it, just kind of very lightly tracing with the glue along the actual words so that I don't have a bunch of glue oozing out around the vellum, because it will show through vellum. Again, not as worried about it with this because I've got so much going on, and you know, there's all the splatter and the glitter and all that fun stuff. But still, it's a habit to not apply too much adhesive when you're adhering anything with vellum. And then I've adhered those sentiments that I had added all the ink to that are now dry. So I adhered those with the Craft Tacky glue as well. And then as a final bit of embellishment to kind of finish these off, I have some Studio Caudia iridescent star crystals, which are gorgeous. When I remembered I had these, I was like, they're perfect for this background. So I pulled those out, as well as some like coordinating kind of colors of crystals. These are from Little Things by Lucy's Cards, and I have some tangerine and raspberry for my pink and orange card. And then for the purple card, I used grape and blackberry along with the iridescent stars, of course. So I kind of sprinkled these throughout the background of both cards, and then just adhered them into place with my Craft Tacky glue and the jewel picker. So just kind of laid everything out and then adhered them into place. Just got to let the glue dry, and then these cards will be complete. So like I mentioned earlier, I will have a link to my blog post. I'll have supply lists with all the links to everything I used. There'll be a link here at the end to the previous video I did with this technique if you want to check it out. And then in my blog post, which is always the first link in the description box below the video, in my blog post, I'll have a very clear link to Stacy's blog post, which I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't, because her cards are phenomenal. The technique was phenomenal, so all credit goes to her for coming up with it, because I just think it's so much fun. So all the links will be below. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.